Good afternoon and welcome to this tutorial on luminosity masking. Today we're going to be working predominantly in Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Photoshop. Now you can see here I've got a number of bracketed exposures, and what we're going to do is we're going to merge these together using luminosity masking in Photoshop. We're going to do a little bit of processing initially in Lightroom before we send them over, so we'll go over those steps, but we'll do all the final work including the luminosity masking in Adobe Photoshop. So let's get started. So here you can see I've got some images of the Charlotte skyline. I've got one here where the sky is nice and deep and rich hues and lots of little textural elements in the sky. And then I've got one here where you can see some more of the foreground elements, the buildings, some of the shadow detail, but the sky starts to get blown out. So I would like to take the best aspects of these two images and merge them together into one. Now I could just use the merge to HDR option that Adobe has, and that does okay, but I've found I've got much better results out of using luminosity masking than doing the typical merge to HDR. So first thing we need to do some basic pre-processing in Adobe Lightroom before we send this over to Photoshop. So when I say that, the typical things I like to do is I like to go in and do my lens corrections. I like to also do noise reduction, and then I'll do a little bit of exposure adjustments in here. One of the other things I like to do is I like to boost the blue saturation a little bit. So in here I'm in the develop module of Lightroom, and I'm at the very bottom, and at the very bottom you'll see you've got this calibration panel right here. There's one called blue primary. If you bump the saturation of the blues a little bit, it actually makes some of these reds and oranges a little bit richer as well as your blues. So I just like to do that as a matter of personal preference. Now I'm going to go up here, and one of the other things I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to enable lens profile corrections, and I'm going to remove chromatic aberration, and I'm going to enable those profile corrections we talked about. And you'll notice the vignetting went away, it got a little bit brighter in here, and it's automatically selected the lens that I used to take this shot. Now from here I'm going to go up a little bit more, and one of the things I'm going to do is I like to do noise reduction, but I like to do the masked noise reduction. So what I mean by that is if you hold down the Alt key in Lightroom and you drag this slider, you'll see the image turns black and white. That means it's applying noise reduction more to the masked areas of the image and less to some of the darker areas. So typically it's going to reduce the noise in the lighter areas. The shadow areas it won't apply as much. Now this helps so that your shadows don't get too muddy. So I want to make sure when I drag this over that I get to a certain value, and then I'm going to want to match it between the two images. So I'm going to shoot for 30 right here, which it doesn't want to cooperate, so we'll say 29. I'll get the other one as close as I can. Alright, now that we've done that, we're going to go up here and we're going to do some basic tone and exposure adjustments. So one of the things I want to do is I like the detail in the sky, I like the colors, I like the hues. It gets a little bit dark and muddy over here. So I'm going to boost the exposure just a little bit here. And you can see in this example right here, everything kind of pulled over from the right, but the shadows are getting clipped a little bit here on the left end of the histogram, which is why we're going to use luminosity masking to pull in some of the shadow detail from the other exposure. The other thing I want to do, now that I've bumped the exposure just a little bit, is I want to bring the highlights down so that areas like this over here aren't too hot and too bright. So I'm going to bump that down just a little bit, and then I'm going to boost the whites a little bit, and I'm going to drop the blacks. And the reason I do this is it increases the contrast, and it does a little bit better job, I think, than just using the contrast slider. The other thing I'm going to do is sometimes when you get some neat little clouds and stuff in the sky, it can be helpful to add just a little bit of clarity to your sky to increase that detail a little bit in there. Now you don't want to get too heavy-handed with it, because if you get too heavy-handed with it, you get something that looks pretty grungy and very high contrast. I like to use just a little bit, so maybe right around 15 or so is good. And then I also like to use dehaze just to kind of make some of the darker tones a little bit richer in here. And again, you don't want to get heavy-handed, because if you get heavy-handed, you get something that's super saturated and it darkens up a lot of the areas to a point where it's not very believable. So I want just a little touch of this, and then I'm not going to touch anything down here in terms of vibrance and saturation, because we're going to handle that in Photoshop, and I feel that does a better job. So that image is pretty good. Now we're going to go over to our brighter exposure, Now this exposure is where we want to get some of the shadow detail back from. And you'll notice if you look at the histogram, it's getting clipped a little bit over here on the right, and then that's this detail right here that kind of gets lost. So what I want to do here is I'm not worried about getting the sky because that's what we have the other exposure for. Here what I want to do is I want to get the shadow detail. So the main exposure and tone adjustments I'm going to make are to brighten up those shadows a little bit more. Not too much because they might get a little bit noisy on us. And then I'm going to do the same thing where I boost the whites and I drop the blacks a little bit to get a little bit better contrast. And I'm going to drop the highlights. Now the reason I'm dropping the highlights a little bit is for areas like over here next to this building. I don't want to have a blooming effect going on that creates too much of an unusual halo here when I start merging these together with the luminosity masks. So I'm going to drop that just a smidge. Again, I'm going to go over here to the clarity slider. I'm going to bump this up a little bit, especially since we've got some more architectural features here in the foreground. I want to get some nice, hard, clearly defined edges on those things, so I'm going to bump the clarity a little bit. I'm also going to bump the texture just a smidge. Again, I'm going to stay away from vibrance and saturation. I'm going to leave those alone. I'm going to go down here. We're going to go down to noise reduction. And again, I'm going to click the Alt button. And then I'm going to drag over until we get 29. Well, 30 is pretty close, so we'll leave it at 30 to match the other image. And the reason I want to make sure that these numbers are as close as possible is so that when I take this over to Photoshop, and I go to auto align the layers, there's a better chance it's going to do a better job aligning because it won't start to blur the edges along some of these buildings and stuff. It'll have an easier time lining up the geometry that it sees. So now I'm going to go down here and I'm going to enable the profile corrections that we did on the last one. And then I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to boost that blue channel down here a little bit, comparable to what I did with the last one. Alright, so now we're good with our two exposures here in Photoshop. So we're going to go back to the library module. And I'm going to go to the grid view for just a minute here. So we have two different exposures. One of them is right here, and the sky one, the one that has the darker, richer sky that we want, was taken at f11 1/15 of a second. The image that has the foreground elements better exposed the way we want was, again, f11, but 1/4 of a second this time. And you can see here, there's a little bit of clipping that goes on, but most of it is a little bit better, especially at the low end of the histogram. Fits within the histogram a little bit better than the previous one, where all of those pixels over here are clustered up against the left side of the histogram, and there is definitely some clipping going on in the shadows. So even if you were to brighten those shadows, two things would happen. Either A, you would get a lot of noise, and or B, if you do recover the shadows, you may just see blobs of gray because there isn't enough detail there because it's gotten clipped out. So that's the whole point of using luminosity masking, is you can take the best of both worlds, a bright exposure and a darker exposure, and combine those two elements to your liking. So now that we've got that set up, now what we can do is we can make sure both images are selected, and they are. So I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to Edit In, and then up here we've got a couple of different options. You can do Edit in Adobe Photoshop 2020. You don't want to do that. What that'll do is that will open up each image in its own file window in Adobe Photoshop. What we want to do is we want to go to the very bottom here, and we want to open as layers in Photoshop. So this will open up both documents in one file, but as separate layers in Photoshop that then we can align. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and we're going to launch Photoshop. Okay, so now we're over in Adobe Photoshop, and what I want to do is I want to go over to my layers panel, which has disappeared on me for some reason. Alright, so let's go over here. We'll turn the layers panel back on. I don't know how it got turned off. And you can see here we've got both images in the same file. And if you look, they look pretty close to being lined up. That's probably because I was using a tripod to shoot this. So I want to make certain these are as aligned as best as they possibly can be. So I'm going to select both layers, and then I'm going to go up to Edit. And then you can see here I've actually highlighted this tool because I use it quite a bit. I want to auto align the layers. So I'm going to click on that, and then I'm just going to let Photoshop figure out how best to align these. So I'm going to leave that as auto. and I'm going to leave these two things off because I really don't want it messing with especially geometric distortion. I would rather do that in post-processing. Once we're done here, send it back to Lightroom and have it do the adjustments for us. So I'm going to say OK. It's got to think for a second, and now both images are aligned, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the brighter image to the top, and then I'm going to alt-click here on the Add Layer Mask button so that I mask that out completely. Okay. Then what I want to do is I want to click on our darker exposure, and I'm going to go over to the Channels tab over here, and I'm going to look for the channel that has the greatest amount of contrast, specifically the one that it looks like there's the most dark tones in the shadow areas that we want to pull out, because what we're going to do is we're going to use this to create our layer mask. So looking through these, I think the red channel is actually the one we want. A lot of times it's the blue channel, but depending on the image and the colors that are present and when you took the image, you just need to pick through these and find the one with the most amount of contrast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the red channel down and I'm going to duplicate it. So now we have a red copy. I'm going to rename this to luminosity mask. All right. Now what I'm going to do is I want to exaggerate the differences between the bright areas and the darker areas. So I'm going to go up to Image, and I'm going to go to Adjustments, and I'm going to go to Curves. Now you can do this with levels. You can do it any number of ways. I prefer to use curves. So here is our curves dialog box right here. So I want to make some of these darker grays darker and some of these lighter areas brighter. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pull this down a little bit. I'm actually going to pull this slider over just a smidge, and then I'm going to boost some of those lighter grays. And you can see already the image is getting much more contrasty, which is good because this is going to be a mask, so it doesn't have to be perfect, but we do want it to emphasize keeping some of the detail in the areas that you see in white here versus boosting the color from the lighter exposure in the darker areas of the image. And you'll see what I mean in just a minute here. So we're going to say OK. So now we have our luminosity mask. Now I'm going to control click this, and you'll see the little marching ants showing it's a selection. I'm going to go back over to the layers, and I'm going to click on this black layer mask right here. First thing I want to do though is, because I want to paint in pieces of this lighter exposure into the darker areas, I need to invert that selection. So I'm going to hit Control Shift I, and now the marching ants change just a little bit, and what I can do is I can get my paintbrush tool, and I'm going to hold down the Alt button and right click on my mouse and drag to the right to make a nice big paintbrush, and then I want to keep that hardness relatively low. This one's at 8%. I think that's pretty good. The other thing I like to do is I'll keep the opacity down lower. So I might do it at 25, 30, 35% and build up in layers of color. So before I start painting on this, I also need to check and make sure that the default color swatches over here are black and white, and that white is in the foreground color. So I'm going to go ahead, that's set to white, I've got my brush set correctly, and now I can start brushing in parts of the lighter image without affecting too much of the sky. Now I will start to affect the sky where it was gray in the layer mask, so that's something you just have to watch for and be careful with, and you can spend more time tweaking your luminosity masks to try to minimize how much impact they have on the sky and stuff like that. It's really up to you how much time you want to spend on it, and you can see I'm starting to get a little bit of haloing around the buildings, so I'm actually going to paint in a little bit up here so that it doesn't look like I've got too much of a halo effect going on. And again, I'm just building up with multiple brush strokes here. And I think that looks pretty good. It's a little haloed around here, maybe smooth that out a little bit. And so now you can see our little mask down here, and if I shift click it, turn it on and off, you can see the effect that our luminosity mask has. Okay. The other thing you can do is you can alt click to see what it looks like in the main view here. So I'm going to alt click again, turn that back off. I'm pretty happy with the result of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this into a smart object. So on my keyboard I just have a shortcut here for that, so I'm just going to hit that. And it takes a minute to convert to a smart object, and the reason I do this is because it's It maintains a little bit more intelligence with some of the filters I'm going to apply to this here in just a moment. And then I'm going to do the same thing here with this one. All right, good. So now we've kind of got both exposures where we want them. The lighter exposure did carry over a little bit more of the brighter sky, which I'm not real excited about because I kind of lost my little sky trail right here. So I'm actually going to go in. I'm going to select the lighter exposure. I'm going to go up to Filter, and then I'm going to go to Camera Raw, which is basically Adobe Lightroom inside of Photoshop. And what I want to do in here is I'm actually going to, again, I'm going to drop the blacks a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit more clarity, and then I'm also going to add a little bit of dehaze into the mix. And now you can see we've got some of that detail back again. So the nice thing about this luminosity masking is you can go in after the fact and you can tweak it a little bit as you go through, but ultimately we still have an image that is already right off the bat much, much better than the original Photoshop document was, or the original DNG was. So the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here, I'm going to select both layers at this point. I'm going to say Control-Alt-Shift-E, and that's going to create a duplicate copy of these two layers merged together into one new entity. And I'm going to turn that into a smart object again. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to enhance the micro contrast. I want to add a little bit of glow to this thing, and then ultimately I will add a vibrance adjustment layer on top of this to kind of make some of these colors pop. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go up to Filter, and then I'm going to go down to Sharpen. I'm going to go to Unsharp Mask. Now what you can do with the Unsharp Mask, and you can see my machine is already set up to do this, if you have a large radius and just a small amount, it does a very good job of doing this micro contrast here. Sorry. So turning the preview off, turning it on, you can see it's just a subtle change, but it does make a big difference. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to say OK to that. I like how that looks. And then the other thing, if you want to get a little bit fancy with it, is you can actually duplicate this layer, and you can get rid of the resulting smart filter of the Unsharp Mask. So I'm going to say Clear Smart Filters on that one. I'm going to go back here though, and I'm going to go to Filter, and if we wanted this to have a nice glowing effect through here, what you can do is you can go to Filter, you can go to Blur, you can go to Gaussian Blur, and then you can kind of bump that up a little bit. It depends on your camera, your megapixels, and your resolution. Mine, I think for an image like this, 9, 10 pixels should be good. Maybe bump it up just a hair more. There we go, 10. Say OK. And then what you do is you change the blend mode. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to change the blend mode, and I'm just going to play around and see what looks good. So you have soft light, you have overlay, and you'll notice a lot of these are making it much more contrasty, right? So maybe I don't use one of those. Maybe I use something like Screen. Screen looks okay. It's a little too punchy, and we've lost a little bit of detail. So what I want to do here, it's a little too dreamy looking. So I want to knock that back a little bit. You can do it two different ways, opacity or fill. When you're using screen blending mode, fill is your better bet. So I'm going to set that down to just 50. So you can see we get just a little bit of glowing around here. It's not as obnoxious. And now everything I think looks pretty good. The only other thing I want to do is I want to add a vibrance color adjustment layer in here. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to click on Create New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to go to Vibrance. And now I'm going to say, okay, let's boost the vibrance up here a little bit, and we'll boost the saturation a little bit at the same time. And the reason I do an adjustment layer here is it's non-destructive. I can always come back to this Photoshop file and undo it, and you can see right away the blues are bluer, the greens are greener, the oranges are a little bit more orange, the yellows are a little bit more yellow, and you can control the effect by coming back here at any time and saying, okay, maybe I want a little bit more saturation, adjust it a little bit, and then you can minimize that, go back to your other thing, and now you've kind of got everything the way you want it. Now, because we sent this over from Lightroom, when I go back and I want to do the geometric corrections here for these buildings that are leaning backwards, because I sent it over directly from Lightroom, when I click to close this, it's going to prompt me to save, and it will automatically sync back with Lightroom. And in just a second, we'll be back in Lightroom. Now we're back in Lightroom. I'm back in the develop module here of our image, and you can see it automatically renamed it the same as the file was before, appended edit.pst to the file. And what I can do now is I can go ahead and I can adjust for those geometric distortions that we're seeing. Because of the fact that I had the lens tilted up a little bit, you can see because of perspective, the building edges aren't exactly parallel to the edge, and I want those to be nice and squared up. I always start by trying auto first just to see if that gets me where I need to be. And that actually did a really good job. Usually if auto doesn't work, I will come in here and I will use the guided option, and I'll draw out a couple of guides along two edges that I know should be parallel. I'm pretty happy with this, so I'm going to stick with that. The other thing I can do is once I'm back in here, I can do some additional toning adjustments. So for example, this highlight over here is a little bright. The shadows got a little bit dark and contrasty. So maybe I want to bump those shadows just a little bit just to brighten them, not a lot. And the nice thing is, because we blended two raw images together with luminosity masks, I've got the best of both worlds in terms of the data that's there. So I can drop the highlights a little bit. We can, like I said, bring up the shadows. I can bump the whites, drop the blacks a little bit again. And then the other thing, if I wanted to come over here and say just emphasize this sky trail right here, I could use something like the oval selection tool and kind of zero in on that guy and then invert it. And then what I could do here is maybe I add a little bit of dehaze to it. Ooh, that's a little bit too much, isn't it? Now feather that out a smidge. And maybe what I do too is I drop the highlights again. Nope, the highlights are a little too iffy. So maybe we actually try the contrast slider. And again, with Lightroom and Photoshop, it pays to just play around and see what you get until you get a result that you like. I'm starting to like this a little bit more. Maybe we add a little bit more clarity. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. And there's no obvious haloing around it, but that sky trail is much more pronounced now. So now I've got something that I feel pretty happy with. You know, I might ultimately come back here and clone out some of these flags and stuff like that. That's something you could do while you're in Photoshop. But I just wanted to emphasize the general process here. So now that I've got that, I've got something I can export out as a TIFF or as a JPEG and upload to the portfolio or share on a social media site. But that's the basic steps of how you take basically two bracketed exposures from something like Lightroom, bring them into Photoshop, use some luminosity masking, blend the two exposures together to get something a little bit more realistic. And if you compare it to the original images that we had the sky from this image over here. There we go. And then we had the shadow area from this image here, and we blended them together and did some adjustments to end up with this image here, which is a lot more pleasing. We've got the corrections, we've got the shadow detail, we've got some nice lights in the building, and we've got some nice colors in the sky back here. So thank you all for taking the time to view this tutorial. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave those in the comment bar below. Or if you want, you can email me at mcmanusphoto@outlook.com, and I'm happy to help any way I can. And happy shooting. Thank you.